Welcome to this three-part presentation entitled The Freemason and His Records. My name is Rob Hamilton and I'm a Freemason and past master of a number of lodges. I am hoping that through my experience you will be able to place more Freemasons into your family history. The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views and opinions expressed herein, belong solely to the Creator and do not necessarily reflect the views of Family Search International and RootsTech. Do you have a photo of one of your ancestors dressed up in all his finery, his dinner suit, gold embroidered apron, collar, gauntlets and jewels? If this is the case, then rest assured he was a Freemason. But Freemasonry was very, very secretive. So, did they have records? Yes, they certainly did. During session 1, we're going to look at some of the history that led to the establishment of Freemasonry as we know it today. Session 2 will look at the type of records that they have left. And in Session 3 we will do a case study on a typical Freemason. If you feel that you have a Freemason in your family tree, this is the series that you need to watch. For many of us, our first encounter may well have been when we discovered our forebears' final resting place. Many Masons' headstones are inscribed in great detail, and we're going to look at some of the symbols of this headstone a little later in this series. You may have discovered a memorial plaque, a historical event similar to this plaque erected by the Grand Lodge of Texas, dedicated to people such as Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, the men of the history of America that fought at the Alamo. Perhaps you've seen honour boards similar to this. Most Masonic lodges will have boards of this nature, commemorating either all the past masters of the lodge, or in this case, all the men who fought in the Great War, 1914 to 1919. Or perhaps an old strange newspaper clipping, such as this from the Australian goldfields of 1851. Men from all over the world gathered to make their fortunes. Men from England, Europe, and of course the fields of California. The first lodge in the very, very British Australia was in fact French. Hence the notice is in both French and English. It's interesting to note that the meeting place was the Black Hill Hotel. This was not unusual, for there were no Masonic buildings in those days. The pub was the place to settle all differences and reorganise life the way the Masons would like to see it. If we are to truly understand the records, it's always beneficial to the researcher to have at least some understanding of the events that led to the formation of a particular group, and from that, the drivers for the creation of their records. This presentation is not an in-depth historical analysis of that subject, but more a broader overview. One could say that the art of Masonry was originally driven by a need to construct permanent shelter. This could have been in the most simplest of forms. But as civilization developed, mankind started building bigger and better stone structures. As this happened, the Mason developed unique clothing, perhaps the most recognised item of which is the Mason's apron that we see today. Masonic symbols turn up in the least expected places. Look at this advertisement for mild York River tobacco from London. The gentleman is wearing a Masonic apron. There's a square around his feet and he's holding an object in his hand. This object is often depicted in a past master's jewel. We'll talk about those a little later. Some will tell you that Masonry is as old as perhaps the fabled Tower of Babel, a tower built by Nimrod using masons. This was constructed around 3500 BC. Indeed, Masonry and the Tower of Babel are linked in what is the oldest surviving Masonic document. This document is known as the Halliwell Poem and dates from around 1400. Whilst the scribe may have been a literate Mason, he was more likely a priest or monk commissioned by the local authorities to prepare a document for the Mason to live by. According to Masonic history, that is, the history of the Freemason, Masonry originated with the building of King Solomon's Temple. And indeed, there are many biblical references that may be cited in support of such a claim. However, Masonry as we know it today is more likely to have started with the development of stone places of worship and major fortifications. It was here that the Mason honed his skills in both architecture, geometry and mass labour organisation. If you've got these elements, then you have to start, of course, to keep records of what you are doing and who you're employing. Perhaps some of the first records that we're ever going to see are the Mason's marks. This, from York Minster, dated from around 1154. These marks became more and more complicated, but in the majority of cases you will find they consist of straight lines or points, all of which could be cut with a stonemason's hammer and chisel. The mark represented the man's name. It may have represented the position that the stone was to go into the building, the top of the stone or the bottom of the stone. It was all related to where the mark was placed and the direction of construction. In step with the development of a trade-based organisation were the advancements in architectural design and the capacity for greater and greater buildings. Of particular interest is the mastery of complex mathematics, geometry, and an understanding of the forces of gravity. These skills led to the sophistication of the principles of the arch, which in turn led to the development of flying buttresses. These developments led to the construction of very, very tall monumental buildings with relatively thin walls. As the trade became more organised, trade guilds began to be formed, and it is there that local township records may be found, particularly in the guild minutes, apprentice records and local court hearings. Many of these records are housed in local history centres. In the early days of development, Masonry appears to be moving at a steady pace. It's principally dictated by the church and, shall we say, nobility's quest for fortifications and large stone homes. However, there are a number of people and events to come which will reshape the social landscape of the British Isles and Europe. These changes have a massive impact on Masonry. This point in time, the mass population lived in the most basic stone structures, or in homes built from scavenged material from the immediate location. Local timbers, mud and fuse constructed basic dwellings in which humans and animals often shared the same structure. By the late 1500s, construction work was running at a fair pace. King James of Scotland and later of England appointed William Shaw in 1583 as Master of Works for all government-type buildings. This is perhaps the turning point in Masonry's history and for the trade in general. The establishment of national rules of conduct and skill recognition through a system of apprenticeship was later to become known as the Shaw Statutes. The next big event is the Plague or Black Death of 1665. This brought further changes to architecture. Vast numbers of the population were struck down, the slums being the most devastated. But so too were the rural areas, with some entire townships ceasing to exist. However, for others that may have survived, this was something of a bonus. There was land to be had. The small country allotment of less than 10 acres now became upwards of 30 acres. This 30 acres produced a marketable surplus. With the marketable surface, there was a new wealth generated, and so the landholder wanted to build a better and more substantial house. It was at this time that the two-storey simple design for the farmhouse was developed. 1666, and we have the Great Fire of London. The fire levelled everything within the old walled city. Every wooden structure was gone. 13,200 homes, most civic buildings, 87 churches, including St Paul's Cathedral. Under King Charles II, the rebuilding of London was mandated to be of masonry, either stone or brick. And so we have a perfect storm. The plague has wiped out much of the population. The Great Fire of London has destroyed all the structures within the walled city. William Shaw has established the Shaw Statutes, which regulated the way masonry was to be operated. And King Charles II has dictated that all new structure within the walled city is to be of masonry. So we find that we've got masons arriving in London. Their principal places of employment would have been around Covent Gardens and St Paul's. And around those areas, of course, you'll find there's the Apple Tree Tavern, the Crown Tavern, Goose and Gridiron, and the Rummer and Grapes. It was in these four establishments that the first four lodges met and elected to form a new Grand Lodge. And so it was that in 1717 the foundations were put together for the Grand Lodge of England. This then commenced our modern era of Freemasonry. Similar Grand Lodges followed in Ireland and Scotland. As we know from history, the government of the day was extremely suspicious of any group or society, particularly those societies that met secretly. Freemasonry, of course, was a secret society. The government needed to find a way of banning these organisations, and so in 1799 they passed the Unlawful Societies Act, or Secret Society if you like. This effectively outlawed Freemasonry. However, with the strength of their Grand Lodge, the Freemasons were able to lobby government and continue meeting on the one condition that they maintained records of every Mason that was a member. For every meeting, those records, those lists of records, had to be handed to the local magistrate. So it was enacted in law that Masons, Freemasons, must keep records. And it is these records to which we look to for our Masonic records of today. By the way, that act was not repealed until 1965. In less than 100 years from the formation of the Grand Lodge of England, the British Empire had a toehold in almost every corner of the then habitable globe. Places as far away as Tasmania, New South Wales, India, the Cape Colonies and Canada were all settled by the British. With settlement came the military regiments. Each of these military regiments had a Freemasons Masonic Lodge attached to it. Why a Masonic Lodge attached to a military regiment? Well, it gave all the members of the regiment a club-like social outing, but it also meant that the local inhabitants could be invited to join Freemasonry. If you as a local joined the British club, the Freemasons, then it would be very difficult for you to wage war against your own club. And so it was that the British used Freemasonry as part of their conquest of the locals. And of course, these Masonic lodges needed a license or warrant to be a legal lodge. These warrants are known as travelling warrants, the vast majority of which were issued by the Grand Lodge of Ireland. So the records for any of these lodges will be held in Ireland, even if the regiment was British. The warrant was Irish. So now let's just step back a little bit. Back to 1733. There's 18 men who've gathered at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern in Boston to organise the first Masonic Lodge in North America. This lodge became known as St. John's Lodge. Generally speaking, these Masons represented the well-to-do gentlemen of Boston and operated with an English warrant from the Grand Lodge of England. Some years later, in fact in 1752, a number of working men of Boston, with the assistance from Masons from two of the British regiments, formed St. Andrew's Lodge under a warrant from the Grand Lodge of Scotland. This lodge met at the Green Dragon Tavern. Looking at an early map of Boston, which was fast developing, it's easy to see just where these two lodges were. The first, St. John's Lodge, met at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, King Street, Boston. Whilst further away, a little distance from the affluent area, was St. Andrew's Lodge, meeting in Union Street. This lodge and its members are said to have been the home of the Revolution. It was from around here that in 1773 a large number of Masons, along with members of the Boston public, left the Green Dragon for the first political march recorded in history, heading for Griffin's Wharf. This march culminated at Boston Wharf, and today we affectionately refer to it as being the Boston Tea Party. This, in fact, was the start of America's independence from England. The records of St. Andrew's Lodge, St. John's Lodge, and the lodges of the British Regiment of Foot give the genealogist and the historian a perspective that tells of the men, the Masons, and their principles. Is one of your forebears on the lodge record? There are, of course, records relating to men like Paul Revere. And when we look at part 3 of this talk, we'll find that there are also members of his family that were Masons. But there are others, maybe not quite so well known. Men like sailor John Manley, a privateer. Yes, he was a Mason, and his record card shows that he came from Torquay in England. It gives his birth date and the date that he finally passed away. In some cases, this may be the best record of this particular man. Of course, the Masonic record is not restricted to just England and America. During our next 2 sessions, we'll look at the worldwide collection of records, what they comprise of, and how and where they can be accessed. There are many different forms of record. One of the Freemasons that came to Australia was Thomas Pryor. He was transported for stealing poultry, but he has a Masonic record. That will be in England, because he wasn't a Freemason here. Well, we've now looked at very briefly at the history of Freemasonry, the events that led to the establishment of records, and the Grand Lodge of England. From this Grand Lodge, other Grand Lodges have developed throughout the world. Each of them has unique collections of records. In session 2, we're going to look at some of those records, where to find them, and what they actually mean. If you have any queries or Masonic research questions, please contact me at any time on shippo2@bigpond.com. My name is Rob Hamilton, and I look forward to seeing you on our next session. Bye for now.